after tackling those two problems of the instant and the infinity, in Pyrrhus and Cineas, Beauvoir turns to the subject of God because she views having failed in both directions, to collapse themselves into the instant or to expand themselves into infinity. Uh, Humans try to reconcile these two. And so we have a kind of philosophical idea that God is infinite, but he's also an infinite being. So God has both the quality of being a total entity, but while also having the qualities of the infinite. And so God offers to humanity in this world the chance to transcend toward the infinite without losing the sort of particularity that they have now. Beauvoir walks in this section that starts on page 102 of, again, using this philosophical writings text from University of Illinois Press. She walks through some of the ideas that philosophy has expressed about God, but also sort of in an order that she finds more increasingly reasonable. So I think when she starts to talk about God, she starts off with what she thinks is maybe the weakest, or what appears, the way that she presents it, to be the weakest concept, and then gets to a point that's more, I think, for her at least, more reasonable or more understandable, though she'll still sort of reject that. God plays, in terms of sort of philosophical importance, the God has not much of a role in existential ontology. Now, God has a very important sort of psychological role and ethical role when it comes to how people understand their freedom and their projects in the world and that kind of thing. God functions pretty prominently in explanations for those sorts of things. But ontologically, as atheists, there's no God that's structuring the world or anything like that for the existentialists. So we'll see here again sort of why that is important for her. So she says that here we get again this idea: God wills it, he makes it so. And the necessity of the divine being extends over those actions that end with him and saves them for eternity. Right? So here we start with the idea that God is infinity and the plenitude of being, and so there's no distance between God and God's own projects. This is the difference between merely human will and divine will. When God wills, it is. There's a direct correlation between God's will and what exists, because God wills things into creation. He can will it as possible, actual, whatever the case may be. But because there's no different distance, because God is a plenitude of being, there's no separation between him and the world. The world issues directly from God's willing. He wills what he wills is, he wills what is. His will is only the immobile foundation of being. She adds that you can barely then call it a will, and I think within the existentialist tradition that makes a lot of sense, because your will is trying to actualize some possibilities, but there's no like guarantee, because you're a creature of distances and you're having to navigate a situation with other people and their projects that might be counter to, parallel to, helpful or hindrance, a help or a hindrance to your projects or whatever. You can't just snap your fingers and actualize things, whereas God can. But this makes God difficult for us to relate to, right? She says Man cannot transcend himself in God if God is completely given. Man is then nothing but an indifferent accident on the surface of being. He is on earth like the explorer lost in the desert. He can go to the right, he can go to the left, he can go where he wants, but he will never go anywhere, and the sand will cover up his tracks. When God is infinite and complete in this way, he's basically just a distance from us. There's an absolute separation. There's no way to establish a personal relationship with this complete, infinite God who just wills the world into existence from sort of nothing. God gets closed in on himself, right? If he's complete and total, and a total coincidence with himself, then there's nothing for us to relate to, and especially not on a personal level. We then would relate to God like God's an object. And we all know that within monotheistic traditions, and Christianity specifically, and it's the Christian tradition here, and particularly the Catholic intellectual tradition that Beauvoir is engaged with, though I think there are some other religions that have a personal God that you could sort of generalize her points to, but she's really talking about Christianity. It's important within Christianity to have a personal relationship with God. And so if God is this sort of full being and the infinite being that's indifferent to the world, there's no chance to have this. We can't transcend ourselves toward God because God is just some object out there. God has nothing to offer. He can't save us then. Now, she then moves on to talk about Claudel. Everything comes from God, therefore everything is good. This is another problem. Theology treats this as the problem of evil. If God is good and the world issues directly from God, the way that she had just said, how can anything evil come from God? God's good. Evil just doesn't come from good. Good creates good. Good begets good. Where does that come from? So Claudel is leaning into this, and she summarizes here that man does not have to turn away from the earth, and he even has a lot of trouble corrupting this original destination within him because he is a creature of God. It is difficult to do evil because what is the good. Now, she views, though, this as being kind of a heretical position within Christianity. Orthodox Christianity, as Beauvoir understands it, entails that there's the fall, that we are living in sin, and so it's difficult to maintain that humans are essentially good and that we tend to do good. Orthodox Christian view sort of goes the other way. Now, one way that you can address this is that, well, things are good in the world because everything is at the service of our salvation, right? The main narrative, the sort of meta-narrative structure of Christianity is a messianic one. That yes, human beings are fallen and we live in sin, but through Christ we're redeemed, and so we work towards salvation, and at the end of the day, grace is possible. Well, this reduces everything to its use value, basically, Beauvoir says. Everything becomes just a means to human salvation. So the significance of everything relative to any of our particular projects is overshadowed and absorbed into this messianic narrative. That the real meaning of everything is that it plays this role in our salvation. She says, if God's work is completely good, it is because it is completely useful to the salvation. It is therefore not an end in itself, but a means that gets its justification from how we use it. But then how do we know if the melon was really invented to be eaten with our family? Maybe it was invented not to be eaten. Maybe the goods of this world are good only because man can refuse them. This is why St. Francis of Assisi smiled at the world but did not partake of it. For all things you have but praise, says the archaeologist to the Viceroy of Naples, in The Satin Slipper by Claudel. So, again, this throws us back into the problem of we have a universal project, the messianic narrative, but how does anything specifically work within that narrative? We all know that it has this use value as a means toward our salvation, but how exactly does one use it? How do we know that eating the melon with our family is conducive to salvation and not letting it be? We have a long tradition in Christianity of asceticism, of withdrawal from the world, and of self-denial. Think of Lent going on, that I will put aside worldly enjoyments and I will give that up, right? So the problem of things, the meaning and the role that they play in the world, is kicked still back to us. Even within this messianic narrative, we have to decide whether or not and how things would serve our salvation, right? So that is a problem for her. She says, he must therefore decide how to make use of them. His decision is not written in the object, because any use is surpassing, and the surpassing is not giving anywhere. Any use is surpassing. Any use is aimed at the future. I'm using something for some end that hasn't come about yet. If the end had come about, I wouldn't be using it. I'd have no need for it. The end would be accomplished. So as long as I'm using something that uses for a future accomplishment or a future that is not yet, again, if it existed, I could just stop using the thing, right? So she returns to this, the will of God. It has to be in accordance with God's will. That's how we know the role that it plays, whether or not it accords with God's will. And so we renounce naturalism, she says. Nothing is good except virtue, evil is sin, and virtue is submission to the divine exigencies, right? He waits for man to destine himself. So it becomes a matter of figuring out what God's will is and then supplicating oneself, making oneself conform. This then, one, appears to be an appeal to human freedom. It also establishes the grounds upon which we can have a relation with God, because then we're trying to relate to God's will and conform ourselves to it, and so on and so forth. So God then is now sort of opening a little bit, and there's room for a relationship and for the human project of pursuing that relationship, right? The appeal to freedom, though, becomes a little bit of a problem. We'll talk about that. But we also see that when we start to open up God, the roles begin to reverse a little bit, because now we are starting to found the concept in our project. So there's a little bit of it's the beginnings of, or a kind of a role reversal, or sort of a creation now, and the establishment of value is sort of slipping away from God a little bit by conceiving of him as this thing that can be founded by our project, by our relation. If we do that, she says, the Christian then finds himself in front of a personal and living God for whom he can act, but in this case, God is no longer the absolute, the universal. He is that false infinity about which Hegel speaks, who allows the finite facing him to subsist as separate. He is for man a neighbor. Now that kind could satisfy our desire for transcendence, that way of conceiving a God. Because God then himself would become a kind of transcendence. God would have projects. God would have a kind of future. He would always be transcending himself toward certain objects and so on. But that means then that the will of God is no longer written in things. God has sort of, in order to become this kind of project as a for itself, an escape being locked in the in itself, God now takes on this element of self-surpassing, which means that he doesn't have all kinds of fixed essences and properties that can inhere in things. So now, whether or not we can even discover the will of God becomes problematic, because that will is not just written straight out in things. It's a self-overcoming will that's transcending itself. It's a self-overcoming. And so human beings now, we can't quite land on it, because we're surpassing ourselves toward a transcendent that is also surpassing itself. So wherever we land, God's not there, because he's the self-overcoming. He's already left. He's withdrawn. And so we find ourselves in this situation of abandonment here. And so again, that project becomes impossible. This is, I think, Beauvoir's overall sort of philosophical point, is that this refuge into the God of monotheism is not possible because of the structure of human consciousness and the kind of beings that we are. We've tried to craft a haven for ourselves in a transcendent absolute. But that is a project basically doomed to failure, because it's a way of trying to flee the responsibility we have for establishing value and choosing our projects, right? We say, let us listen to the voice of God. That's what the believer will say. He will tell us himself. Beauvoir just says that this is naive. I mean, she just calls that a naive hope. She's not very optimistic about it. She brings up Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling here as a sort of obvious touchstone, that the message is ambiguous, that even if I hear a voice and then I decide, which I have to decide what that voice is, that it is God, the message I receive still carries with it a kind of ambiguity. In Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard imagines Abraham and the anguish that Abraham feels taking his son Isaac up to the mountain to be sacrificed. And the anguish comes about because Abraham doesn't know how to fully understand God's commandment to kill his son. Is God going to let me go through with this? Will I be saved at the last instant? Am I strong enough to do what I'm being commanded to? Is this God that I'm really hearing? Like all of this, in Kierkegaard, I recommend Fear and Trembling. It's a great text. But she moves from Kierkegaard, interestingly, to Kafka. And Kafka's message, this kind of uncertainty that you see in like The Castle. Man can receive the message and even see the messenger, but isn't this one an impostor? And does he know who sends him, and so on? The Messiah says he is the Messiah. The false Messiah also says it. Who will distinguish one from the other? This is a way of throwing it back on humans, to have to make a decision. Even faced with matters of faith, with questions about God, we have to make decisions about how our relationship with God goes. What is the concept of God that we're going to adhere to? What is the role that plays in my life and my projects? What is, if I hear a voice, is that voice God, or is it the devil, or is it my own conscience, or all of that kind of, how do I interpret this message? What am I going to do in the face of it? And so there's no way to flee into God this burden of choice and of having to found our own projects. All a relationship with religion does is provide us with another project that we have to make decisions about how we're going to found it, and how we're going to ground it and navigate it, and so on. You can't disburden yourself of this decision through adherence to some religion or something like that. That's, even if we put it on works, Beauvoir says, that's still not quite. She ends that section saying, man is never in situation except before men, and this presence or absence way up in heaven does not concern him. So we almost get a blending or a synthesis of the problems that we saw in the instant and in the infinite in relationship to God. And you see, again, the end of that section brings us back to our social relationship with other people. The essay opens with that dialogue, and it's Cineas who draws into question Pyrrhus's project. And so our projects are only involved in here with other people in situation, and I can't escape that into the instant, into the infinite, by expanding myself or by trying to find some infinite instant in God, where I can transcend toward the infinite at least. That's still sort of an escape from this world and this situation. And those heavenly celestial things end up being sort of largely indifferent to that in a way, right? So for Beauvoir, we're stuck here. And the next section is a little bit shorter section, actually, and it's just called Humanity. And the whole point of this humanity section is we must therefore turn toward men. Can't we find in humanity itself that absolute end that we were first looking for in heaven? If we see it as closed upon itself, as needing to attain a state of unchanging equilibrium someday, or to annihilate itself, we can undoubtedly transcend it toward nothingness, and anxiously ask ourselves, and after that. So she's trying to bring us around to looking for the values, absolute values, within human existence, and in community with one another, right? She says, through each man, humanity searches indefinitely to rejoin its being, and its very being consists of that. Our transcendence can never surpass humanity, but only accompany it. And yet it will be completely grasped again in each instant, because each instant humanity is. But is it really? Can one speak of a humanity? Undoubtedly, it is always possible to use a collective noun for the ensemble of men, but this would be to consider them from the outside, as objects unified by the space that they take up. This collectivity would be only a herd of intelligent animals. We have nothing to do with this given, fixed in the plenitude of its being, in order for us to be able to act for humanity. It must demand something from us. It must possess a unity acting as a totality that seeks to realize itself, and must appeal to us in a single voice. So she doesn't just turn sort of naively to a general universal humanity. That retains some of the same problems that we saw in infinity and in the instant. To try to speak in this unified voice on behalf of all people everywhere all the time for all history, it just doesn't quite work that way, right? Humanism risks turning humanity into another god, into another transcendent being, rather than finding the value in the concrete, in the actual social, political, familial relationships and so on, right? She even talks about, in this section, the myth of solidarity, right? Humanity takes this form in the myth of solidarity. Often since the famous apologue of the limbs and the stomach, men have been represented as the parts of an organism. By working for one of them, one would be working for them all. There is said to exist a natural economy according to which the place of each one is defined by the place of all the others. But this is defining man in terms of exteriority, in order to occupy a determined place in the world. Man himself must be determined, a pure passivity. So, going all the way back, I mean, Plato and Aristotle, you see this in, Rousseau and in other places, even in, think of the somewhat famous front matter of Leviathan with all the parts, making up the body of the king. In Plato, it's the souls with the gold and the bronze and the silver and that kind of thing. That people have a predetermined place in the system of society. This can only be viewed as an exteriority. We just view society as an inert thing, people as inert objects that can take up a fixed place within a predetermined system. But of course, that's not how people live their life. That's not how people view themselves and their own projects on the day-to-day, in the day-to-day. He does not feel at all like a cog in a precise mechanism. On the contrary, it seems to him that no corner of the world was reserved for him. He is everywhere too much, and indeed his place was not marked ahead of time as an absence. He came first. Right? So, there's not some slot waiting for us in the world that we come into existence and we just pop ourselves into. That's just not how it works, according to Beauvoir, right? We find places for ourselves and create places for ourselves in concordance with other people and in other people's projects. Jobs open up. They're not out there waiting for us. Opportunities open. Think of all of that language of opening up and becoming available and all of that. They weren't out there ahead of time. You know, they had to be made and worked toward by myself and by other people and so on. The sort of interesting, like, Euthyphro problem crops up here where you can't wait around for people to give you a place because people disagree. You know, anytime you've sought advice for something, you know that if you go to different people, they're going to give you different advice. And sometimes, if you're going to people who you know really well, you'll even know how that advice will be different from person to person. Because you know that that person has certain values and projects and things that they think about and that concern them. And so sometimes you have a sense of what a person will tell you ahead of time, and you can even anticipate that that will, you know, conflict with something someone else from a different perspective might tell you, right? So you can't wait for people to give you a place, for a place just to be given or granted. That won't be forthcoming, right? That is not going to be helpful for us. One transcends their place on earth by using it or combating it. I am an instrument for some only by becoming an obstacle for others. It is impossible to serve them all. So here is where we're seeing, again, Beauvoir bucking up against the universalist absolutes, for instance, that you would find in Kant. This particular passage, I think, is running up against that second formula of the categorical moral imperative, the principle of humanity. Principle of humanity states basically you should treat people always as ends in themselves and never as a means to an end. Beauvoir sees that to be a problem because the way in which human projects sometimes conflict with one another, not all the time, but maybe even often, it's not possible for us to only do this. Sometimes I become an obstacle for others. Sometimes another becomes an object in my plan, especially if I'm working against them. That's what she says. I am an instrument for some, only by becoming an obstacle for others. If two people are going out for a job, and boy, right now in academia, if 700 people are going for a job, one person's going to get it, and 699 people are going to lose it. And those people are not, their will is not being actualized. They're not being considered as an ends in themselves. The competitors on the job market are obstacles from the pure perspective of the job market. Now, what makes it excruciating is they're also colleagues and friends, and, you know, if you're working in a company and your team is doing well and the company's looking to promote from within, you might go up against some people for a promotion that you've worked closely with and that you're friendly with and that you respect as colleagues and so on and so forth, right? But one person getting the promotion means that the other people are not. And it's difficult to avoid those situations entirely. And Kant demands, especially, that you always treat people as ends in themselves and never as means to an end. And Beauvoir thinks that just given the sort of concrete facticity of human life that is involved and engaged in certain projects, such an injunction is impossible to follow. It's not the sort of thing where she's like, oh, well, yes, that's a hard rule to follow, and because it's so hard, I'll just get rid of it. She's not saying like, oh, Kant presents us with a standard that's too hard to live up to. No, she's just saying that the very structure and reality of human existence makes it impossible to do the thing that Kant is saying. And the only reason Kant can say that is because he's looking from that abstract universal. He's severed all of his ties from the concrete and from everybody who he has a particular relationship with, and he's thought about it in the abstract. But as soon as you go back to living, which is what you have to do, there's no escape from it. Your project, your engagement, now we're back and we're committed to these particular things. And what we had decided in the abstract doesn't quite, hold. So I think that I will come back and pick up the humanities section, and then we'll do the humanity in the situation, and that will be part one of Pyrrhus and Cineas, a really rich text where Beauvoir runs through a lot of really important concepts for existentialism. So I will talk to you about humanity in the situation in the next video.